Welcome to the Exploration Podcast from Hoare Lea, a place for curiosity, creative thinking and fascinating conversation.
Hello and welcome to the Exploration Podcast from Hoare Lea. I'm Ellie Griffiths and today I am delighted to welcome Amir Hussain, founder and CEO of YemiTech. YemiTech is a technology company that uses data and innovation to create positive social change. Prior to that, Amir founded Yemi Architects based in Yorkshire and has also contributed to many other groups focusing on social change. For example, Leeds City Region Enterprise Partnership, West Yorkshire Housing Regeneration and Place Committee, and Transport for the North. Amir, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sally. Pleasure.
So to start with, can you tell me a bit about your journey so far? What are your passions and interests, and how did you end up creating YemiTech?
Well, I think everything really stems from the fact that I grew up in Bradford and I kind of lived in quite a challenged and deprived place. Didn't realise it was a challenged, deprived place at the time, but looking back, it was. And I think what it really did was shaped my outlook on the world from the point of view of somebody who's from an ethnic minority background, from a religious minority background, in an environment where there was very little aspiration. And essentially, as I developed and sort of took a very circuitous route through education and eventually sort of ended up studying architecture, starting my own business and getting involved in some of the organizations that you mentioned, what I realized is that there's a massive disconnect between what the strategic plans of places are and their desire to create really good outcomes for them, and the nature of what life is like within those challenged, concentrated sort of pockets of communities. And I think that for me, this was manifested when you kind of look at the fact that there's lots of organizations and initiatives that will do things to help people, whether that's getting into higher education or quitting smoking or losing weight or starting a business. But all of them are predicated on the individual themselves making that first move to decide to start that journey. And the issue is that so many people haven't got to that stage where that seems like something they want to do. So if there's somebody who's got to that point, then they can accelerate ahead on the back of all of these initiatives. So what I think really shaped my view of the world is, how do we create integrated places where people understand and are exposed to the opportunities in a way that doesn't require them to search it out and look for it themselves. And I think when it came to starting Yemi Architects in Bradford, it was the ability to recognize the attributes that were inherent in those communities, and how do we leverage those to make things economically viable? How do we create things that could be far more distinctive as a place-based offer? And that really formed the cornerstone of what we did with architecture in the built environment, which was centered on understanding places like this and being able to sort of celebrate that diversity and present that diversity out to a much broader audience. Fast forward to YemiTech. Well, that came about through about 5 years of working with data, driven by some of my team members. They were the ones that were the brains behind it, not me. And what we found was that using geospatial mapping to evidence what we knew was happening on the ground and what we could see was incredibly powerful. And it really led to a position where we thought it made sense for us to focus on that as a future rather than a more traditional architecture business. And so for me, that journey from traditional to tech has now led to a position where we've got an incredible platform. We've just signed a partnership deal with the world's biggest GIS mapping company, Create ArcGIS. So that's with Esri. We're now in discussions with sort of big national organizations, and we're having I think a very pivotal impact on the ESG reporting sort of criteria and agenda. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of sort of that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I've taken a look at this platform online. For everyone who's listening, can we explain a little bit about what it is? What I've seen are some really impressive maps that are showing hotspots for all sorts of social data. It might be, I imagine, data from census showing people's age or ethnicity, and then also showing, what amenities, etc., are concentrated in which areas. Can you explain a little bit about what it looks like and what the data feeding into it is?
Yeah, sure. So, there's actually a really big overarching idea, and it is, how do we empower people, businesses, stakeholders to create better places around them? And we feel that there is a really sort of innate desire within the private sector to do good things.
Yeah.
And we're really being the conduit for that. And the way that it works is to localize all of the data around any given point. So you can drop a pin anywhere, put in any postcode, zoom into any place. And the zone around it could be 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes. It can be whatever you choose it to be. But the key factor is, how do we understand who's living within that catchment zone through all the demographics you just mentioned, so all the census data, but localized to that area? Where are there pockets of potential excluded groups, maybe over 65s, or where is there a concentration of one minority ethnic or religious group? Where is there people of very sort of low social economic position? And then once we've got an understanding of the baseline of the kind of the human characteristics of a place, we then look at what provision of facilities are there, and particularly what's missing. So what things are missing from that place? Or do they not have a park? Do they not have an ATM machine? Do they not have, EV charging? Or what are the things that are not there? And so that instantly identifies the gaps. It also identifies the concentrations. If there's already 19 coffee shops in that zone, maybe adding another one isn't a good idea. It's about understanding that sort of sense of place. But probably the bit that I would say is the cleverest and certainly the most unique is our ability to data scrape all of the activity and event data that all of the different organizations are advertising online in that zone. So what that means is we can start to understand who these stakeholders are, who their target audiences are, what the overall sort of offer is within that area, generally sports or arts or music, or what are the things that are really dominant and which are the things that are missing. And if we're able to identify those potentially excluded demographic groups, well, now we can start to see, well, who's operating in those areas? So you may have somebody operating a Zumba class in a church hall. You may have somebody who's organised five-a-side football, or it's not an asset, it's an activity. And how might they have relationships and access into those excluded communities that isn't immediately obvious to us? And most importantly, how do we ensure when we do interventions in that place that we don't inadvertently displace the work that they're doing? How, in fact, can we complement it? And how does our presence assist them and drive an integrated, fulfilling place around that given asset? So that's sort of the approach and the method that we use.
So, I don't know, an example of where you might inadvertently do something wrong, if there was a village or a town hall that was putting on all sorts of events and you replaced it with something else, not realizing how much that was. Is that the sort of thing you're talking
Exactly.
about?
So if you imagine somebody's organized a Zumba class at a church hall for women, for example, and they've got somebody that's now been empowered to do something, has got that sense of purpose in their lives, have got something that is creating a value add to that locality. And let's say, I don't know, David Lloyd turns up and puts in a really big swanky gym and puts on 500 activities a week, for example, which is kind of the kind of number of things that they do. And somebody thinks, well, actually, this Zumba class is really good and I really like seeing Shirley and Tracy and, whoever. But this place offers so much more. I'm going to now go across there and so I'm going to give up this and I'm going to start my membership there and I'm going to go to this big corporate gym because it offers such thing. So for that organization to recognize that this group exists and how might they take a more collaborative approach to their offer, and maybe not do Zumba in their sector, and in order to do something that complements the organization that's already on the ground. It's that sort of nuance of sort of application that we want to try and ensure that organizations that are either invested in places or are doing things that they're planning to do in a place, it's done in the most inclusive way possible.
So that brings me on to my question I'm really interested in is, so who's using this platform? Initially I was thinking town planners. Now I'm wondering if David Lloyd comes to you and asks, is it that sort of group that want this data?
We've been on a really interesting journey in this. We've come at this as architects, in that we've run an architectural practice. We've been using it ourselves to understand what things are missing in a place, and so how do we really create a proposition that is complementary. And what we've found is that, in most cases, developments really get forced into communities, whether the community likes it or not. And very often it's not. They prefer not to have it. What our approach does is to understand the place and understand its gaps and shortcomings, and then design an intervention that will respond to those gaps. So we found that initially it was the architectural, urban design, councils, regeneration. It was that sort of area that we were focused on, and they were our kind of key target audiences. What's actually been happening is that those conversations have now extended to big major investment funds, where they are investing heavily in assets in places, and they want to understand to what extent can we measure how that place is performing, and to what extent does our presence there improve that place. So when we look at ESG reporting, the demand and need to do that, and the S part of that, the social part of that, is now sort of a much stronger requirement than it has been in the past, has meant that actually we've now got an audience in the financial services sector that is crying out for a solution, and they're all in various stages of creating their own social value toolkits. So this allows us to really respond to that audience.
I mean, it sounds like you could be enabling social KPIs in the S and ESG that perhaps never existed or never could exist because they weren't measurable before.
This is exactly how we see it. So, if somebody was going to look at, for example, I don't know, the Shard in central London, and say, well, this is a fantastic asset. It generates X amount of revenue. It performs in this way as an investment asset. But from a social location performance perspective, well, it's in an area that has, I don't know, I'm just making these things up, but let's say that the air quality is not very good. Or let's say actually the accessibility to green space is very poor. And let's say that the number of activities that are free is very, very low. And let's say that the area's ability to provide facilities and assets and services that meet the needs of a more diverse community is very low. So actually, on a social score, it actually performs very poorly. And so it's about understanding location performance, so that people that have an interest in that area, whether it's because they're employing people there, because they're buying an asset there, and so on, are able to measure that. And we believe that we have got not only the most sophisticated, but actually the most intuitive and the most inclusive platform for measuring social fulfillment of places. So that's a pretty big thing.
Yeah, incredible. Can I touch on something you mentioned earlier around 15-minute cities, or as you mentioned, 10-minute, 30-minute, whatever minute cities there are, but 15-minute cities is what's sort of bouncing around the news at the moment. Can you explain? I mean, to me, this sounds like it's just a 15-minute perimeter effectively around a spot on a map, and how you might be able to get all of your amenities you require within that 15 minutes. Is that what it is? Is that the definition? And are people asking you to your platform to help them achieve this kind of goal?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this has been a concept that's been around for quite a long time, and it was really sort of started by somebody called Carlos Marino in Paris. And it's really interesting. We're actually in collaboration discussions with Carlos Marino and his organization. So he's a great advocate for our platform, which is phenomenal. And we're currently working with the City of Austin, Texas authorities. And we're also in the process with two quite advanced negotiations with the Dubai municipality as well around their plans for, they're doing a 20-minute city plan for their 2014 strategy. So this idea of having your levels of fulfillment in a walkable zone around where you live, I think really took hold and accelerated after the COVID pandemic, because people spent so much more time in their communities. And in some cases, they really found there's just nothing there. Because they're no longer going into work, they're not going into the city, they're now just within their communities. And actually the provision was incredibly poor. So I think that the COVID pandemic accelerated this whole concept of 15-minute neighborhoods. And it's something that's now prevalent across, many parts of the world are now taking it up, and many parts of the UK, and trying to integrate that into a local plan, I can imagine is really challenging. So the issue, I think, that has arisen from this, because it's taken on almost a conspiracy theory, and has become something that people have equated to controlling the population and actually reinforcing segregation and actually reinforcing people within zones, and then therefore people that are outside zones. And so there's been a lot of, I would say, misinformation around it. And I would say it manifested itself in Oxford, and sort of the issues that occurred when they tried to go down this route.
So these were the protests that were hitting the newspaper headlines.
Exactly, yeah. They really, I think, became the poster child for the cause of sort of rebelling against this concept. But you see, the thing from our point of view is that if you try to impose a major sort of form of social engineering almost onto a place at a district-wide level, to me, it's almost inevitable that it's going to be resistance. I think what's really valuable from our approach is that we take the view that if you enable any asset owner or any stakeholder or any regeneration plan to simply make their own 15-minute, 20-minute neighborhood better by filling in gaps, well, then you're doing something at a much more dynamic, much more granular, much more bottom-up approach. And actually, I think it's fundamentally much more deliverable. And so the ability to actually achieve the same thing, but at a micro level across a whole district in a series of overlapping 15 minutes driven by individual interested parties, is what really our platform enables. And it's that I think is kind of where the current proposition is always going to meet challenges, both at a public level and at a council delivery.
So how does the sort of grassroots approach work? Is that, there's that ex-cafe owner and helping them where they should be locating, or?
Yeah. So I mean, we generally sort of take the view that it's easiest to go with the stones that roll. So, for example, somebody's about to do a development. It's going to be a major development. They're going to do something in an area. Well, if they just understand their 50-minute context and include things into their scheme that are missing, maybe EV charging or biodiversity or things to do with, I don't know, an ATM machine or whatever. If they can do things that will enhance that area, not just for their own development, but actually for everybody that lives there, well, it's going to have an easier time through the planning process. It's going to have an easier time through the public consultation. It's going to have an easier time through the planning committees and all of those processes.
And is that enabled because the planning committees will actually have your kind of data to understand what they should be putting in?
Yeah. So what we found is when we've deployed this and presented information back to planners and others, we're presenting them information they've never seen before. And so if for example, that 95% of the people of the activities within an area you have to pay for, well, it means that 95% of the community is excluded unless they can afford to attend. if somebody is doing a development and they're going to drive their Section 106 payments with agreement of the council towards an organisation that's on the ground that's tackling a particularly identified issue, well, that can be far more beneficial than an arbitrary sum that goes into a general pot. So how does that development have a positive impact on the challenges in the area? So that always is going to be something that we feel is well received by council. But also, I think that it's about being able to say to one of the big four supermarkets or all of them, well, how would you make the location around your customers, where they live around your stores, better, because these are some of the challenges that are there? Well, then that becomes something that they can do. When we look at investment funds and they're investing in places across the whole of the UK and putting money into whether it's build to rent or office buildings or other types of assets, how do they understand the location performance of all of their portfolio? And then we also have situations like, we had a conversation with Deloitte not long ago, and they were talking to us about, buildings becoming stranded assets becoming stranded because the demographic circumstances around them have changed to such a degree that that asset no longer performs in the way that it did do previously. And so how do they sort of simulate and understand that happening into the future so they are able to advise their clients, this is how you need to ensure that your portfolio needs to evolve in order to avoid that happening. So that's the kind of, those are the sorts of uses where we see it deployed.
So I'm trying to think. It seems so obvious that we should be designing inclusively, and yet we're not. Apparently, the data is showing we're not. Is that just because we have never had the data? Why don't you think we design inclusively? What are the blockers?
I think we have to look at how many people who are designing places understand exclusion to be able to respond in the design. And I think that for me, I started out by sort of saying that, coming from Bradford, coming from a polarized, challenged minority community, shaped my view of the world. And I think that's a key component in this. And in the same way that I would say that architects in the 50s who redesigned all the housing in areas and created sort of high-rise estates didn't really understand the people they were designing for. They were nearly all predominantly white, male, middle class, and they were designing for a demographic that they really didn't understand, and they didn't recognize the communities at a relationship level. So that's something that I think still happens. So the fact that this information exists but hasn't been articulated into a way that allows people to drive actions is the bit that I think has been missing. And that's really where I would say our strongest strength is in understanding not only what assets we need to include to ensure that minority groups should feel that they are catered for, but then also to ensure that where you have very heavily polarized places that maybe are serving one minority need very well, may indeed be excluding many others. And so it's understanding both sides of that coin.
I'm sad to say we're running out of time, but I would just love to ask you one final question, which is around, what's next for you? Where does this platform go from here? Is it just bigger and wider to make sure more people and groups have access to it, or have you got other plans in the pipeline?
Well, that definitely, but we want to get to become the penultimate social fulfillment benchmarking tool in the world. And for that, we need to drive adoption. We need to be into the systems, the existing systems, whether that's Experian, Land Registry, Planning Portal, and all of those kinds of organizations. And for it to be the accepted tool and platform that is recognized for providing the most accurate insights into places. So that's the big prize. But ultimately, we believe that it will lead to change on the ground. it will lead to empowerment, it will lead to integration, and it will lead to places becoming not only socially more fulfilling, but then the economic rewards of that could be lower voids, higher rents, higher values, lower insurance premiums. And so what's then the economic value of places performing well? That's the goal.
I can already think of a few projects this would be really useful to use on. Thank you so much, Amir, for joining us. That's been fascinating. I could have talked all afternoon.
Me too.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The Exploration podcast was brought to you by Hoare Lea. For more information, you can find us at hoarelea.com. Music was supplied by Kevin MacLeod at incomputech.com.